All right, so we're diving into The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And it's all about why companies that seem to be doing everything right, listening to customers, investing in that cutting-edge tech, bringing in big profits, they can still totally miss the boat and end up failing. Kind of a head-scratcher, right? But Christensen, he lays out a pattern. And we'll be using his book as a lens to look at some really interesting examples, like how the disk drive companies rose and fell, or how those steel minimills shook up a whole industry.
It is fascinating, isn't it? How we see a company fail and just think, oh, they made bad decisions or they didn't keep up. But this book, it goes deeper than that. The Innovator's Dilemma argues that good management might actually be the problem. Not that those managers get you lazy or anything like that, but that the very things that make them successful can also make them blind to those big disruptive innovations.
So they're so focused on steering the ship that they don't even see the iceberg right in front of them. I think Christensen uses Sears as an example, right? Like back in the mid-1960s, they were on top of the world, winning awards. Everything was great for them. But while they were busy celebrating, something else was happening.
Yeah, you had those discount retailers
Yeah.
and the home centers popping up all over the place. But Sears, they didn't seem to notice. They were so focused on what their existing customers wanted, the ones with the money, that they completely missed this big shift.
It's a classic example of what Christensen calls, resource dependence?
That's the one. You're so reliant on keeping those big clients happy that you don't see what everyone else is starting to demand.
It reminds me of that old saying, nobody wants to buy a faster horse. Right? They were thinking about just making things a little bit better, not realizing that the whole game was about to change. Like when the car came along.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And that's where the whole idea of disruptive innovation comes in. It's not just about some fancy new technology. It's about how that technology can completely change how the game is played. Maybe the best way to understand this is to look at the disk drive industry. It's a crazy story with tons of twists and turns. But it perfectly shows the difference between what Christensen calls sustaining innovations and disruptive innovations.
All right, all years. What made the disk drive industry such a good example of this?
Well, it's like this microcosm of the innovator's dilemma, right?
Yeah.
New technology always popping up, shaking things up, and companies either adapt or they die. I think one of the biggest disruptions in the disk drive world was that the drives themselves kept shrinking. We started with these massive 14-inch disks, then they went to 8-inch, then 5.25-inch, 3.5-inch, and so on. And every time the size went down, it had this ripple effect. The established companies would get disrupted, and new companies would come in and take the lead.
So it wasn't just about the technology itself, but how that new tech shifted everything. It made new opportunities and made the old ways obsolete.
You got it. So think about thin film disk coatings. That was a sustaining innovation. It made the drives better, which is what the mainframe computer customers wanted. The established companies, they loved it. They were listening to their big clients and making money.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? You invest in what your biggest customers are asking for.
Right, but then you have the smaller disk drives. Those were disruptive. At first, they couldn't hold that much data, but they were smaller, lighter, and cheaper. So they were perfect for these new markets, like mini computers, and most importantly, personal computers.
And that's where those companies that were so focused on making things a little bit better, they got caught off guard, right?
That's exactly what happened. Take Seagate, for example. They were doing great in the 5.25-inch drive market. Then the 3.5-inch drive comes along, and they basically ignored it. Their PC customers, the ones making them all the money, they didn't need it. They wanted performance, not size.
So Seagate, just like Sears, they fell into that trap of resource dependence. They were too focused on those existing customers that they missed what was coming next.
It's like they had blinders on. By the time they realized the 3.5-inch drive was a big deal, it was already too late. All these new, smaller companies had already taken over. And this pattern, the innovator's dilemma, it just keeps happening in so many different industries.
It's kind of scary, actually. If these companies with all their money and smarts can get disrupted like that, what hope is there for the rest of us? Is there even a way to see these disruptions coming before they hit you like a tidal wave?
That is the million-dollar question, right? But the good news is Christensen gives us some clues. He outlines 5 principles that explain why good companies that are doing everything right logically, can still fail when these big disruptions come along.
All right, let's get into it. What's the first principle?
Well, the first one is resource dependence. Like we saw with Sears and Seagate. It's like that friend who spends all their time trying to please their significant other. and forgets about all their other relationships, not a good strategy in the long run, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just listen to your customers. You have to keep an eye on what's happening on the edges, those new needs and technologies that might seem small now, but could become huge later.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second principle, small markets. Small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies. These disruptive innovations, they usually start in small, niche markets, kind of like a tiny seed that can grow into a massive tree.
But those small markets are tough to predict, right?
Yeah.
It's like trying to pick a winning lottery ticket.
You got it. And that's the third principle, the unpredictability of markets. Especially with these disruptive innovations, it's really hard to know how big they'll get or how fast they'll grow.
So even if a company wants to invest in something disruptive, it's still a gamble. It's hard to justify spending a lot of money on something with such an uncertain future.
It is. And even if they could see the future and were willing to take the risk. We have the fourth principle. A company's capabilities can become disabilities. This means the things a company is really good at, their strengths, can actually make it harder for them to adapt to something new and different.
So the things that make you successful today can actually hold you back tomorrow. Kind of like a basketball player who can shoot three-pointers like crazy, but can't dribble the ball. They're in trouble when the game changes.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then there's the fifth principle, to make things even more complicated. It's called technology oversupply. This happens when technology gets better faster than the market needs it to.
So it's like a smartphone with a camera that can take these super high-resolution photos. But most people are just using it for quick pics to post online. All that extra technology is just overkill.
I like that. That's a great analogy. And this gap between what technology can do and what the market actually needs, it creates an opening for these disruptive innovations. They may not be as powerful or fancy, but they win because they offer other advantages, like simplicity, convenience, or lower cost.
Like when those first digital cameras came out, they couldn't match the quality of film cameras. They were so much easier to use, you didn't have to wait to get your pictures developed. That was a game changer.
Perfect example. So we have these 5 principles that explain why good companies might miss the boat. But how do they navigate this whole landscape? To answer that, we need to talk about value networks.
Value networks. I'm curious, tell me more. What are they and why are they so important?
Well, think of a value network as the ecosystem a company operates in. It's like this web of relationships between suppliers, distributors, customers, competitors. Each network has its own rules, its own cost structure, and its own incentives.
So, like different species living in a rainforest, they all depend on each other.
Yeah.
And they have to adapt to the conditions of the environment.
Exactly. And if you want to navigate disruptive innovations, you have to understand how your value network works. One important idea here is upward and downward mobility. Companies in those high-margin networks, like the ones making luxury cars or high-end computers, they often want to move upmarket to make even more money. But this can make them blind to opportunities at the lower end, where these disruptive innovations often start.
It's like climbing a ladder, right? It's easy to go up,
Yeah.
but harder to climb back down. You get comfortable at a certain level and stop paying attention to what's happening below.
That's a great way to put it. And to see how these value networks work in real life, Christensen uses another great example, the steel industry.
Steel. Okay, I'm intrigued. How did disruption shake up the world of molten metal?
Well, it's another classic innovator's dilemma story. Back in the 1960s, you had these new steel producers popping up. They were called minimills. They started at the very bottom, making rebar, which is the simple steel product used in construction.
So they're like those discount retailers.
Yeah.
Or those small 3.5-inch disk drives. They seem small and unimportant at first, but they have the potential to really disrupt the big players.
Exactly. And at first, the big integrated steel mills, they didn't even notice these minimills. They were too busy focusing on high-margin products, like sheet steel, the stuff used in cars and appliances. But the minimills, they had a different way of doing things. They were lean, efficient, and hungry. They could make money selling rebar at prices that would have put the integrated mills out of business.
So they found a niche, a place where they could thrive without directly challenging the big guys.
Exactly. And as their technology and processes got better, these minimills started moving up market. They started making more complex products, slowly chipping away at the integrated mills territory.
And I bet the big mills didn't see it coming. They were so focused on their existing products and customers.
You got it. It's the innovator's dilemma all over again. Which brings us to the big question. How can companies avoid this fate? How can they manage all this disruptive technology and stay ahead of the curve?
All right, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What's the secret? How can they avoid becoming just another cautionary tale?
That's what we're here to figure out, right?
Exactly.
Well, Christensen, he doesn't give us a magic formula or anything, but he does give us a framework to think about these problems, and that's a good place to start.
All right, so how do we actually use this stuff? Like, I get the principles and all, but how can companies actually apply them?
That's the key question. And to answer it, we need to understand how companies can create new capabilities.
New capabilities. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it this way. When a company faces a disruptive innovation, it's not just about adopting new technology. It's about changing how the company works, how it makes decisions, how it allocates resources, everything.
So it's not just about buying a new piece of equipment. It's about rewiring the whole company's DNA.
Exactly. And to do that, companies need to create new capabilities, new ways of doing things that are aligned with the demands of this new disruptive world.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture, but how do they actually go about creating these new capabilities? It can't be easy, right?
You're right, it's not easy at all. Christensen outlines three main mechanisms for creating new capabilities.
Right. Let's hear them.
First, you have acquisition. Buying another company that already has those capabilities.
Seems simple enough, right? Just buy your way into the future?
Not so fast. Integrating an acquired company is tricky, especially when you're dealing with a disruptive innovation. You have to understand where the real value lies. Is it in the people they have, the processes they use, or the values that drive their decisions?
So just buying a company isn't enough. You have to know how to integrate them effectively to really capture those capabilities you're after.
Exactly. The second mechanism is internal development, basically building those new capabilities from scratch within the company.
Sounds tough, right? Especially for big companies that are used to doing things a certain way.
You're right, it's very difficult. Changing how a company works, its processes and culture, it's like trying to turn a giant ship around.
So you need something more than just a few tweaks here and there.
You need a complete overhaul. You need what Christensen calls heavyweight teams. These are dedicated groups with the power to make real changes.
People who can actually cut through the bureaucracy and get things done.
Exactly. And finally, the third mechanism is spin-out ventures, creating a whole new independent organization to pursue the disruptive innovation.
So kind of like setting up a mini startup within the bigger company.
Exactly. This gives the new venture the freedom and agility it needs to succeed.
But wouldn't that create conflicts with the main company? Like what if they start competing with each other?
That's a real risk, but Christensen argues that the benefits of spinouts can outweigh the risks, especially when you're dealing with a truly disruptive innovation. He gives the example of Quantum Corporation. They were a big player in the hard drive market, and they spun out a company called Plus Development to focus on the 5.25-inch drive market, which was seen as this low-end niche thing at the time.
So they gave this new venture the space it needed to thrive without being held back by the main company's priorities.
Exactly. And plus, development ended up being a huge success. It helped Quantum stay relevant in a rapidly changing market.
So spinouts can be a way for big...
Exactly. But with disruptive innovations, the market is so unpredictable. Those forecasts are often completely wrong.
So you can't just plan your way through disruption.
You have to be willing to experiment, to test your assumptions, and learn as you go.
It's like navigating uncharted territory.
Right.
You need a different kind of map.
Exactly. Discovery-driven planning is about embracing that uncertainty. It's about setting up a process where you're constantly learning and adjusting your course based on what you discover.
So it's not about having all the answers up front. It's about being willing to ask the right questions.
Exactly. It's about being humble enough to admit that you don't know everything and being open to new information.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about creating new capabilities and discovery-driven planning. Anything else?
There's one more thing I think is really important. It's understanding the role of organizational capabilities. These are the things that allow a company to do what it does. It's not just about having the right resources. It's also about having the right processes and values.
So it's like a recipe, right? You need the right ingredients, but you also need the right instructions and the right cook.
Exactly. Christensen talks about this framework called RPV, which stands for resources, processes, and values. Resources are things like people, money, technology. Processes are how the company does things. And values are the beliefs and principles that guide decision-making.
So to be successful, a company needs to align all three of these things.
Exactly. And when faced with the disruptive innovation, Companies often need to create new processes and even change their values.
Because the old ways of doing things might not be effective anymore.
Exactly. Christensen gives the example of Toyota and General Motors. In the 1980s, Toyota was disrupting the auto industry with its lean manufacturing processes.
Toyota was all about efficiency and continuous improvement.
Exactly. But General Motors, they were stuck in their old ways.
It was still focused on mass production and economies of scale.
Right. And Toyota's values, they were all about teamwork, empowerment, and respect for people.
Which is very different from the traditional top-down management style.
Exactly. And this difference in values, it was reflected in their processes. Toyota's processes were designed to empower workers and encourage innovation.
While General Motors was still stuck in this command and control mentality.
Right. And this difference in processes and values, it ultimately gave Toyota a huge competitive advantage.
So it's not just about having the right technology. It's about having the right culture and the right way of doing things.
Exactly. And this is one of the biggest challenges for established companies. Their existing processes and values, they're often deeply ingrained. It's hard to change them, even when you know you need to.
So how do companies overcome this challenge? How do they break free from those old ways of doing things?
Well, that's where those three mechanisms we talked about earlier come in. Acquisition, internal development, spin-out ventures.
Right, those are the tools for creating new capabilities.
Exactly. But even with those tools, it's not easy. It takes a lot of effort and commitment to change a company's culture.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. Now, I think it's important to note that Christensen doesn't say that big companies are doomed. He actually believes that they have a lot of advantages. They have resources, expertise, brand recognition.
They just need to learn how to leverage those advantages in a new way.
Exactly. And that's what the innovator's dilemma is all about. It's about giving companies the tools and the mindset they need to navigate disruption and thrive in a world of constant change.
All right, so we've talked about a lot of different concepts here. But I think one thing that keeps coming up is the importance of mindset. It's not enough to just understand the mechanics of disruption. You have to have the right attitude and the right way of thinking.
You're absolutely right. Christensen talks about the need for what he calls a disruptive mindset.
Okay, what does that look like?
Well, it's about being willing to challenge assumptions, to question the status quo, and to embrace uncertainty.
It's about being comfortable with not knowing all the answers.
Exactly. It's about being curious, experimental, and adaptable.
It's about being willing to learn from your mistakes and move on.
Exactly. It's about seeing failure not as an end, but as a beginning.
It's about seeing disruption not as a threat, but as an opportunity.
Exactly. And this disruptive mindset, it's essential for any company that wants to survive and thrive in the 21st century.
I think that's a great point to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today. But I think the most important takeaway is this. Disruption is inevitable, but how we respond to it is up to us. We can choose to be victims, or we can choose to be victors. And the choice is ours.
That's a powerful message.
Well said.
And it really is a choice, isn't it?
It is.
You know, Christensen, he highlights this interesting debate about electric vehicle battery technology.
Oh, yeah, that's a hot topic. Every time I read about electric vehicles, there's always this discussion about batteries. Are they good enough yet? Can they really compete with gas-powered cars?
And it's a valid question.
Yeah.
But it seems like a lot of car companies are stuck in this waiting game.
Yeah.
They think that once there's some big breakthrough in battery technology, then electric vehicles will be ready for the mass market.
So they're waiting for that perfect battery, one that can go as far as a gas tank and cost the same. Like they're waiting for all the stars to align perfectly.
Exactly. But Christensen, he argues that this kind of thinking could be a trap. It shows that they're too focused on the mainstream market. They're trying to make electric vehicles fit into the existing car world instead of thinking about how they could disrupt it.
So instead of creating a new game, they're trying to play the old game with slightly different pieces.
Exactly. And by doing that, they might be missing out on chances to develop and sell electric vehicles in those niche markets where the current battery technology is already good enough.
Right, like those urban delivery services or the short-range fleets we talked about. They don't need a car that can go 300 miles on a single charge.
Exactly. So instead of waiting for some magic breakthrough, these companies could be out there learning and experimenting, building a foundation for future success in those markets.
They could be getting real-world experience
Yeah.
and becoming leaders in the electric vehicle space.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not reactive. It's about shaping the future, not just waiting for it to happen.
I like that. So we talked about the principles of disruptive innovation. We've seen how they play out in different industries. And we've even talked about how they might be shaping the future of cars. But how do we tie it all together? What are the big takeaways here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the innovator's dilemma, it gives us this framework for understanding how innovation happens and how disruption unfolds. It's not just about specific companies or technologies. It's about recognizing the patterns, the forces that drive both success and failure when things are changing.
So it's like a toolkit for navigating the world of business and technology.
Yeah.
It's about knowing the traps, seeing the opportunities,
Yeah.
and being brave enough to embrace uncertainty.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book so valuable. It's not just about the past or even the present. It's about equipping ourselves to shape the future.
And that brings me to you, dear listener. As you think about your own work, your own industry, what are some of those potential disruptions? Those things that might be flying under the radar right now?
And what can you do to make sure you're not one of those companies that gets caught by surprise?
Because disruption is coming one way or another,
It is.
and how we respond to it
Mm-hmm.
will determine whether we sink or swim.
That's a great way to put it.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the innovator's dilemma. We hope it's given you some new insights and inspired you to think differently about the world. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.